Hello, welcome to this webinar on the power of breathing basics. My name is David Depler. I'm founder of Breathe Your Truth. I've got my team in the background. Together, we're going to take you through a 30-minute experience, kind of a mix of lecture and then actually things you're going to get to do. And then the juicy part, we're going to break for some questions at the end. So if you're ready, let's do this. Now, when we did a live version of this, we asked people to categorize themselves. I'm going to do the same with you. Take a moment and reflect on your experience around breathwork and identify yourself as one, having had experience in mindfulness-based practices, non-judgmental awareness, or two, you've done hypoventilation practices. In other words, things that have some type of breath retention, breath holding. It could be Buteyko breathing, it could be free dive training, it could be oxygen advantage, intermittent hypoxic training type practices. The third category are hyperventilation practices where you're taking big breath in, big breath out. It could be fast, it could be slow, but it's big breathing. Things like Wim Hof, Sudarshan Kriya, holotropic breathing, rebirthing. Those are all really big breathing practices. And then the last category is you have no experience with breathwork at all. Now, I'm assuming you have experience with breathing, but just not a formal practice around breathing. So let me show you what our first group of 80 showed up as. Most people, many people, 40 people of the 80 actually had experience in mindfulness-based practices. So those non-judgmental practices, which are awesome because there is great power in these practices. The second least experience were with the breath retention, the breath holding, the intermittent hypoxic training, maybe free dive training. This is key. The second most popular practices were the hyperventilation practices, so those big breathing practices. Remember this, we're going to come back to this. And then there were a couple people who had no formal practice with breathing. The next question we ask folks, and I'm going to do the same with you, is to reflect back on the last couple weeks and answer the question, what do I generally notice about my breathing? So again, in the last couple of weeks, you think about your breathing. What do you generally notice about it? And what we saw was 75% of the people had things that they noticed that we would say aren't exactly positive. Things like, I tend to breathe through my mouth a bunch. I notice shortness of breath that seems out of proportion for the activity that I'm in. I find myself breathing in my chest, or I find my breath being really shallow and fast. These are all things that don't translate to good breathing. 25% of the people said things that kind of fall in categories that we would say, yeah, that sounds good actually. I tend to notice that I slow my exhale when I think about it, or when I think about my breathing, I automatically relax a little bit more, or when I do full breaths, I actually feel better. If you are in that category of the 75, know that you're in really good company. It is true that poor breathing is wildly common. Kyle Kiesel out of the University of Evansville has shown that when we look at breathing through the lens of mechanically how we move, chemically what's actually happening with gas exchange, and psychophysiologically what's happening with the mind and the breath relationship, we see that 60 to 80% of the people, most people, are breathing in ways that are dysfunctional enough to impair functional movement. In other words, impair the way we think, feel, move. This is further supported by Rakimov's work. Rakimov is a Russian Buteyko instructor who's compiled decades of medical information to show that over time, we seem to be breathing like maniacs. So our basic metabolic need would have us otherwise breathing at 6 liters per minute. In other words, we're moving 6 liters of air per minute. But what seems to be happening over time is we're breathing more and more and more, all the way up to 12 liters per minute. We're doubling the amount of air we need by the end of the day from what our metabolic need actually was. Now, while breathing more might sound good, like you're thinking, okay, if I breathe more, I get more oxygen. Turns out it's not the case. When we breathe more, we change our chemistry in a way that makes life harder. Literally, it traps oxygen in the bloodstream so that it can't get into the cells, which is where we actually do the work with oxygen. We're going to come back to this. I just wanted to plant the seed now. This is further supported by the work we do with people individually when we use technology called capnography. Specifically, we're using a device called a Capno Trainer. We see most people coming in with breathing patterns that tell us they're breathing much more than they actually need, and there's a negative effect on this. Quick story about a yoga instructor that I recently worked with who has years of experience of teaching breathing and even her own breath practice. Now, she came in thinking, when I get hooked up with the Capno trainer, I'm going to be excited to see my numbers look awesome because I feel good with my breathing practice and I do all these things. She came in looking like most of us mortals, and that's lower than baseline CO2. What she's been doing and giving the breath so much attention is actually walking herself into more hyperventilation. Now, the cool part about this story is she discovered two things. Number one, it doesn't take much to right-size the breath. It's actually subtle shifts, but seeing it on the graph made it much more accurate, much more real for her. It didn't take her long to reach the second thing, which was when you actually decrease your breathing skillfully, in the right way, at the right time, you feel better. So she had a bump in energy from this practice. So this brings us to the goal of this presentation is to bust some myths around good breathing for the sake of expanding your vision around what is good breathing and actually show you a superpower you've got. Tap into a skill you have that I'm quite certain for most of you is going to move the dial forward. All of this information comes from an 8-week class that we're releasing called the Breath Catalyst. This is a class that journeys through many of the dimensions of breathing, from the physical, the mechanical part of it, chemically what's going on, and then the mind part of it, giving you time to actually have an experience that will change your breath fitness score, change your fitness around breathing. I'll come back to this at the end and give you a little bit more information, but just wanted you to know that if we hit a vein that feels very interesting to you, know that there's a resource to help you really dive into this for yourself or for people that you're working with. So let's take a step back and let's acknowledge the crazy, broad, big landscape of breath work. So breath work is really a very general term to mean some very different things. We can do practices, like I said earlier, that actually retain the breath, that actually slow it down, that decrease the amount of ventilation, or even build in really aggressive breath holds under load, like with intermittent hypoxic training. And that is considered breath work, and there are benefits to that. And then we've got other practices that are just the opposite of that. Big hyperventilation practices, breathing in, breathing out. Those practices tend to sort of hack the nervous system, if you will. In other words, they create a reset in the nervous system that can be beneficial. Now, they do it at the expense of another system that we're going to talk about. And then we've got a third category of breathwork practices, those things that are just mindful, that non-judgmental awareness of the breath, letting changes come forward over time. So if we look at this landscape, it'd be easy to say, okay, well, what the heck? I mean, how do I even know where to start? And then just how most of us feel. Before I give you that information of where to actually start, and we will get to that, I want to say that I actually believe in all these practices. There is a place for them. They have a positive effect on our breathing, on our chemistry, on our psychology. The trick is to get the context right, and most of the time people are not getting the context right. In other words, they're doing a skill, they're doing a practice before they actually have the skill for it, or they're doing it for the sake of getting something that they could actually do something different and get that even faster, better. So the landscape is broad, and I'm hoping that even in this brief time we get together, I'm going to give you some pointers into how to pick the intensity and the type of practice. We're going to bust some myths now around correct breathing. Let's start with the mechanical aspect. So what you see before you is the triple M triangle of good breathing. These are the lenses through which, when we look at breathing, we actually get the full picture. If we look at just one dimension of breathing, it's likely we will miss key parts that then undermine any real progress. So let's go after the mechanics first, and let's do something together. I'm going to have you place your hands on your lower ribs so that your thumbs are pointing back behind you and your fingers are pointing forward. Breathing in and out through the nose, just allow your tongue to rest gently on the roof of your mouth. Letting go of any tension in your low back, and feel how as you take a breath in, those lower ribs can expand. So as you draw a breath in through your nose, you feel a very gentle expansion of the lower ribs. Now you likely also feel your fingers move. In other words, you're getting belly breathing as well. It's not to say it's only in the low back, but I want to see if you can feel that very gentle expansion of the lower ribs in the back. And if you can, that likely means that your diaphragm is descending beautifully. If you don't feel any movement, it either means you can't feel it, or it may mean that your diaphragm is not dropping the correct way. So the myth that we're busting here is that good breathing is not just belly breathing. You can sit with tension in your low back, get breathing in your belly, but not get those ribs to move in the back ever so gently. And what that means is your diaphragm isn't descending the optimal way. So real good mechanical breathing is to actually get that little bit of posterolateral expansion, or that little bit of backward movement of those lower ribs. Again, it can be very subtle, it doesn't have to be big, but we've got that movement happening in the low ribs. That's one aspect of good mechanical breathing. Now let's go after mix, or the biochemistry, and we're going to weave a wild story into this lens that essentially says most of the time less breathing is better. I know, totally controversial, but let me give you the backstory on why that's the case. Let's go back to Rakimov's graph that showed over time most people are breathing a whole lot more than metabolically we need. What happens when we do that is we don't actually elevate oxygen. Most of us sit at full saturation of oxygen anyway, so breathing more does nothing to our oxygen level. What it does do is drop carbon dioxide. And when we drop carbon dioxide, hemoglobin binds oxygen more strongly, and oxygen literally gets trapped in the blood. Now let's take a step back and talk about the relationship of oxygen and carbon dioxide, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We have this super cool relationship with plants, where we take in oxygen that they produce, and our waste is carbon dioxide, which they use as their money. So there's this constant gas exchange, bringing oxygen in because we use that for energy to drive every function in the body, and then the byproduct is carbon dioxide that we let go of. So it'd be real easy to think of Rakimov's graph and think, okay, how awesome is that? Not only are we getting more air, but we're getting rid of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is our byproduct, or our waste. There's a really important detail that we need to hold that changes everything, and that's that we have to maintain a certain level of carbon dioxide or life gets a lot harder, and most of us are well below where that threshold should be. So if we breathe too much, we will drop carbon dioxide. That means we change the pH of the blood now in a way that hemoglobin won't let go of oxygen. So we'll have plenty of oxygen in the body, but it can't get out of the blood. This is what happens if you were to take 10 deep breaths. I won't make you do that, but most of us know that feeling. If we take big breath in, big breath out, big breath in, big breath out. If we did that 10 times, and you can try it on your own, most all of us will feel very dizzy afterwards. Now, you're not dizzy because you just over-oxygenated your blood. If we were watching oxygen saturation, we wouldn't have even seen a change. What you did do, though, in that big breathing is dropped carbon dioxide. Oxygen got trapped in the blood. Your brain now is deprived of oxygen, and that's what makes you dizzy. Now appreciate that many of us are doing that on a lower scale all day long. It doesn't kill us, but it does make life harder. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Kirk. Kirk is a fellow Qigong instructor who, after hearing me tell this story, came to me and said, oh my gosh, frequently in my class, people come up to me telling me they feel dizzy and nauseous. Do you think I'm actually teaching them to hyperventilate? And my response was, yeah, probably. And I know the feeling. I've done the same thing in the classes that I teach. When Kirk started to weave in this concept of, at least part of the time, matching the breath with the metabolic need. In other words, parts of a Qigong class are not really physically demanding. They're more of a mental challenge. They're flow. They're easy. During those times, our breathing should actually be very subtle. If all we're doing is saying breathing in, breathing out, the more you do, the better, we walk people into hyperventilation, and that was Kirk's experience. As soon as he started matching the breath with what he thought the metabolic demand was, he stopped hearing from people that they felt dizzy and nauseous after class. So he right-sized breathing. So let's go to that third lens, the mind. There's a crucial connection to understand here, and that's that how we breathe will influence the mind, and where our mind is going, what our mind is working on, will drive how we breathe. If we understand that relationship, we can play the game of entering the equation. We can enter the equation by playing with the way our mind is focusing, or we can enter the equation by playing with what we're doing with our breath. Now, I don't think those entry points are equal, and some people at some point need more time in one area, and that is very daunting to figure out. But we're going to play with a simple practice where we enter from the breath to the mind and let you have an experience around it. We are going to specifically play with the ratio of the inhale to exhale. Now what I'm going to do is walk you through 3 different versions of breathing at 6 breaths per minute. In other words, the breath rate is going to be the same. We're going to breathe at 6 breaths per minute, which is a really nice rate to breathe at when we're alert, awake, and focusing and relaxed. So let's do the first one. This one is designed to help excite the system. So we're going to use a breathing pattern that's actually going to lean into your sympathetic nervous system. That part of your nervous system that gets you woke up, gets you to the party. When done skillfully, it's cool. When it happens to us through life, that usually translates to anxiety. But when we do it intentionally, it can be positive. So let's try that and see if we get a positive effect. We're going to bias the inhale. So we're going to spend just a little bit more time in the inhale, and we're going to minimize just a little bit the exhale. So at 6 breaths per minute, what that means is we're going to take a breath in for a count of 6 and a breath out for a count of 4. Here we go. A breath in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a breath out, 2, 3, 4. Breath in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Breath out, 2, 3, 4. Let's go one more. In, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Breath out, 2, 3, 4. So after just a few rounds of that, if you check in, it's likely you're going to feel that your nervous system is picked up a bit. Usually comfortable, but you can feel that things are lit up just a bit. Let's flip the coin over and take one that actually calms the system. So this is going to help turn on the parasympathetic nervous system, that part of us that helps us rest and digest a little bit better. Again, at 6 breaths per minute, it's going to go an inhale for 4 and an exhale for 6. Let me help you with that. So a breath in, 2, 3, 4, and a breath out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One more. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now just check in. And it's likely what's happened is your nervous system is backed off a bit. You might feel that you're kind of rest in your back body a little bit more. You can feel your connection to the ground a little bit more. All things that translate to better digestion, better rest. You've probably guessed the third category, the next one coming up, which is we're going to balance them out. The goal of this practice is to just reach this place of being alert and focused. Still 6 breaths per minute. We're just going to change the ratio. Now the inhale and the exhale are going to be equal. So together, let's take a breath in. 2, 3, 4, 5. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5. In. 2, 3, 4, 5. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5. One more. In. 2, 3, 4, 5. Out. 2, 3, 4, 5. And check in. And the hope is that's kind of brought you to this in-between place that just, again, feels alert and focused. So this is tip of the iceberg. The point of the practice is to show that we can play with the breath in a way that in short order can change the mind. So let's circle back to the landscape of breathwork, and I want to present a hierarchy of activities. On the low skill end, not meant to imply low effect, but an entry point that most of us do well at is mindfulness-based work. So simple non-judgmental awareness of the breath. Now the downside of this practice is it can be boring and the changes can be slow coming. But still, it's a very valuable practice, and it's usually a practice that most of us can enter at and not actually make things worse. Next up are hypoventilation, so breath holding, breath retention. The downside of these is it can be antagonizing to the nervous system. Now, from a chemical standpoint, they usually always translate to good changes. So as we decrease the amount of breathing, we increase CO2, which is a crucial thing to get right. But if we do it at the expense of the mind, in other words, if we just agitate the system, we can end up with a net loss. So it's why we don't put this at the lowest rung. We actually have to have a certain amount of skill so that we're not just getting the negative side of torturing ourselves with breath holding. Next up, in terms of skill needed to get a net gain from the practice, is hyperventilation practices, so those big breathing practices. Now I want you to remember back to the graph that I showed that indicated that it's the second most prevalent breath practice out there. And again, I'm going to propose that most people doing these practices have no business doing these practices. In other words, they're not at a skill level with their breathing yet to actually get a sustainable long-term gain from this. And we see this over and over when we look at CO2. People who have been doing these hyperventilation practices frequently have even lower than the normal population CO2. For a period of time, they got a nice gain or bump in the electrical activity, the mind part, the neurological part, but they did it at the expense of the chemical part of the triple M triangle, and now over time they've ended up with a net loss. The practice is not bad, but it has to be done in the right context. Now, these practices date back to ancient times, and I'm convinced as you learn the history of many of these practices that these were practices that were held back from the masses. They weren't really presented as something that the common person should do. And it wasn't because they didn't want people to be spiritually, emotionally evolved. It was that they had a good instinct that most people weren't ready for these practices. These people who did these practices were likely also doing practices of hypoventilation. So they were doing things that helped them elevate CO2. So they had a big margin of error, a big bandwidth to be able to hack the neurological or the mind part of the triple M triangle and not end up over time with a net loss. So we put these big breathing practices like Wim Hof, Sudarshan Kriya, holotropic breathing, rebirthing, at a place that says people need to have a certain amount of skill to be able to do them. And I think that the research around these practices, which is a bit iffy, would actually look much better for the practices if people were filtered out for the skill level before they enter them. One last thing I want to add to this hierarchy is right where we started, mindfulness practices. When you have journeyed through these different levels of practice, when you do mindfulness practice, you frequently have an experience that is much deeper, much richer. Now again, in terms of skill, these are relatively easy practices. They're just hard practices to see gains in a period of time that keeps most of us engaged. So we've just come full circle to mindfulness-based practices. I hope that helps give some framework to understand how these fit together, because I do think they fit. Obviously, when we get into the Breath Catalyst or when we work with people individually, we get into this with a lot more detail and we help people find where they actually fit. Right? But it gives you a general framework. So let's do an activity. Let's tap into a superpower you have. This would fall on the lower end of the scale, but up from the bottom just a bit. It's a practice that we frequently see people do very well with, so I wanted to bring it to you so you can tap into one of your superpowers. Let me tell you a little bit about it before I hit play on the graph you see ahead of you. You've probably guessed it already. This is a little bit of a treadmill for your breath. You're going to take a breath in as that blue ball goes up the slope. You're going to take a breath out as it goes down. It's going to set the breath pace exactly at 6 breaths per minute. This is the same thing we did earlier when we wanted to calm the system. You can see that the exhale is a little bit longer. So we're going to start to build up a little bit of tone in the vagus nerve in your parasympathetic nervous system. Hopefully walk you to a place of feeling a little bit better at rest. Couple other things though, I'm going to get greedy with this that we're going to weave into it. We want to honor the mechanical system. So you're going to use that new skill you have. When you take that gentle breath in going up the slope, you're going to feel your thumbs expand back. Even if you don't have your thumbs back there, just imagine them there and get that sense of those lower ribs expanding as you take a breath in. So you're going to direct your breath into the lower ribs. Knowing what you know about the mix, I'm going to invite you to play with the volume of your breath. So there's 2 variables that help determine the level of CO2. The rate that we breathe at, that's going to be set for you at 6 breaths per minute. It's a nice rate. Your job then is to play with the variable of volume. And the invitation is to gently decrease the volume. Now it needs to feel comfortable, because if it's not, it's going to set off alarm bells in your sympathetic nervous system and it's not going to feel good and you'll lose the end game. So the trick is to back the volume of air off just a little bit. Still feels comfortable, but it's a little bit less than what your idle volume might be. And then one last bit, and then we're going to hit play here, is the first part of the exhale. I want you to slow that just a little bit. These are all subtle shifts that we're asking for. So you'll take a breath in as you go up the slope, and as you breathe out, you're going to do a slow the first part of the exhale. Then let the second part just be easy. Take a breath in, slow the first part, out, easy, in, easy. I'm going to walk you through this. I just want you to have heard it once before we do it. All right. I have no doubt you're ready. Let's set this in motion. So we have a gentle breath in and a gentle breath out. As you take that breath in, feel the lower ribs expand very gently. And as you start the exhale, slow it just a little bit. Let the exhale taper off. A nice easy breath into the lower ribs. Slowing the first part of the exhale gives us a little access to the vagus nerve. You're coaching yourself into slightly less volume. Now keep that breathing going, even though the ball has stopped. If you'd like, you could shut your eyes. Research shows that just a little bit of exposure to the right rate, we tend to hold on to it. So keep that going in your mind's eye. And just have that well attended to experience of taking a breath in, feeling the lower ribs expand, breath out, coming down the slope, a little bit longer than the breath in. And you can feel a little amazed at how you can decrease the volume of the breath, and it actually feels sweet. So this activity that you've just done, we call slow the exhale. And it's a way to give good attention to the triple M triangle. From a mechanical standpoint, by breathing into those lower ribs, we make the diaphragm more efficient. We use a lot less energy to breathe. By decreasing the volume of air, we're starting to help carbon dioxide raise just a little bit. That makes it easier for oxygen to get out of the blood and into the cells that need it. So it's another thing that helps us with efficiency. And then by slowing that exhale a bit, we turn on the parasympathetic nervous system, that part of our nervous system that helps us feel content, helps us digest better, helps us think better, just makes life easier. So all of that in that simple practice. Now, I don't want to just leave you with that practice, because if you're like I was, if you're like how many people are, once you learn a little bit about what good breathing is, it's very easy to go out and terrorize yourself with it. In other words, kind of live under the story that, well, oh my gosh, that's how I should be breathing all day long. Let me tell you, no, it's not. All right, we should breathe differently based on what's going on. So there are times where we breathe in our chest. There are times where we breathe shallow. All of that is completely fine as long as we come back to our base. So think of this practice as something that you can do when you want to just take a couple moments and touch your base, which is always a great thing to do. So it is not meant to be that you have to do this all day long. When I first started doing this work in 2005, I was an enormous terrorist to myself, and literally it made things worse. So as I was tracking my carbon dioxide level, what I saw over the course of the first few weeks I started doing this work was I was actually getting worse. And it was because mechanically I was trying to do the right thing. I was honoring the mixed part and decreasing my ventilation, terrorizing myself with it, and I was losing the mental game. And that ended up undermining any progress. It wasn't until I got a whole lot lighter with the practice, and in fact actually gave up on it for a bit, that I started to see things tick up. So I can't overemphasize enough to keep a sense of lightness and goofing aroundness with these practices. It will serve you well. It's a way for you to honor the mind part of the triple M triangle. Now, I promised I'd tell you a little bit more about the Breath Catalyst, so let's do that now. This is an 8-week course designed to take you through topics that serve the triple M triangle. We spend some time talking about how good breathing is not just box breathing. So box breathing, one of the most common breathing practices out there. It's not a normal way to breathe. It can be helpful when we do it in the right context. we're going to talk about active meditation. We're going to do practices that help increase the effect, expedite the effect of that mindfulness-based practice that we recognize as being kind of the beginning and the end, a very important component of breath work. We're going to continue to play in the vast landscape of breath work, and we're going to give you experiences in the hypoventilation, in the hyperventilation, and help you see the context and the skill level that you need to be doing them. We're going to talk about how to use the breath for performance. Generally, this is the intermittent hypoxic world, but we're not going to limit it to just that. Things you can do that improve physical performance and mental performance. We're going to get into the nuances of good mechanics even more. We're going to improve the strength of diaphragm in a way that actually sets movement and thought patterns free. We're going to teach you how to supercharge your recharge time so you get more out of your rest time, whether it's just sitting down to relax or sleep. We're going to introduce some practices that actually serve as an anxiety shield. In other words, they're practices that give us resilience, give our nervous system a bit of a challenge that can actually help us bounce back from stressful situations. Frequently, the answer is not to take stressful situations away, it's to actually change the way we respond to them. And given that anxiety is such a big part of modern day, we've designed some practices that help just build a little resilience, give you a little protective shield against them. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this phenomena of dead space and weave this into the work that we do. Dead space is a term I use to describe those moments during the day where we're in between tasks. We're moving from A to B. We frequently think of those as non-significant parts of the day. And the big revelation for me was to realize they're actually some of the most important times of the day. It's when we tend to muck our breathing up the most, when we're in a time of the day where we don't actually care about, and we're seeing it as just a point to get from A to B. Like we're getting out of the car and we're going into the grocery store, or we're going into work, or we're getting home and we know we need to put bags away, put things away before we really actually rest. Those can be the key times to make changes with our breathing. So we'll play in that world. So the Breath Catalyst is being offered at $497 right now for the next couple weeks. It's generally $697. So get on the waiting list. Don't worry if you can't make all the dates to the live class. There will be a replay for them. If you don't want to wait for the live class, you want to jump in and start the on-demand version right now, that's an option as well. All right, let's break for the exciting part. Let's take some questions. Maybe one last thing about that class. What we're going to try and do with it is actually build on a practice. So even though we've got these different topics we cover, the whole goal of it is to actually build a relatively short practice that's pretty impactful for you, and also bump up just your daily hygiene. That's actually the thing that feels the most important to me, because I know that a lot of us don't really need one more thing to do. And at the same time, a lot of us do better if we've got something to do. So we'll try and do both, where we help people just make changes during daily activities without having one more thing to do. And for those of you who like to do things, myself included, we'll also build a doing practice. All right, this time I really will pause talking. And Patrick, can you start us off? Is there any question that you've seen fly through the chat that you think we should get at? Maybe you saw it repeat a bit.
Yeah, actually, the one question that we have, just the very last one, sorry, I should say, is Lordy asked about is the Breath Fitness score the same as a Bolt, or actually more so if you can define a little bit more of that Breath Fitness?
Yeah. So, Lori, I'm guessing you may not have done the Breath Fitness score. So the Breath Fitness score uses the BOLT. For those of you who don't know, the BOLT stands for Body Oxygen Level Test. It's also, and previously was known as Controlled Pause from the Buteyko world. Patrick McCowan out of the Oxygen Advantage uses BOLT, and he's the one who created that term for it. It's one of the 7 tests that makes up the Breathe Your Truth Breath Fitness score. What we've tried to do with the Breath Fitness score is see if we can get a glimpse into the full triple M triangle. So the BOLT gives an idea of carbon dioxide tolerance, so it fits beautifully in that mix category. Same as if you've ever heard of the test CO2 tolerance test. It's a different test, but both of those tests, the BOLT and the CO2 tolerance test, are measuring your central nervous system's tolerance to carbon dioxide building up. They don't actually measure carbon dioxide level. And the two can run independently. So you can have somebody, we see this with runners all the time. They actually have trained themselves into breathing a ton, breathing more than what they need. And they actually have low baseline carbon dioxide, but they've also trained their bodies to tolerate a ton of pain. And so their tolerance to carbon dioxide is actually really good. All right, but their baseline can be low. Hopefully that was helpful. And if not, Lori, you can jump in and ask verbally. Unmute yourself and talk. All right, Patrick, do we have anything else?
This is my question, actually.
Right.
So Lori said that was helpful.
Great.
So I notice I exhale a lot faster.
Yeah.
Just based on that, the just following the breathing as you exercise just right now. The question now is, I don't know, is that good? Is that not good? I mean, I'm assuming there's several variables involved with that, but I thought I was a little bit of a in and out similar until I had to actually pay attention to it right now. Then I realize I am exhaling a little bit more, or a little bit faster than my inhale.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I've got some theories about it, but let's talk first what we usually know about that is if you struggled to extend the exhale just with that simple activity that we did, and when I say you, I'm talking about any of you out there on the call, mechanically, that's usually a sign that you're having a tough time regulating your diaphragm. In other words, you're not able to actually slow it down and let it come back into its dome-like position easily. So we know there's a mechanical thing to it. I think there's also a psychological thing to it. And here's how I see that story playing out is if we're always kind of leaning into life and we're rushing and we're reaching and we're striving and we're trying, we tend to bias the inhale because it actually excites us. And we lose our skill to actually sit back in our body, let our weight come into our heels, and actually just enjoy the exhale. It is the same thing as saying we get stuck in sympathetic overtone and we become very unskilled at the parasympathetic nervous system. It's kind of the same thing as saying we tend to, especially if you felt this hard part to actually slow down the first part of the exhale, which is kind of the money part. It's the magic part. It's almost to say we're really good at rushing over the top of the parts of life that are actually really very sweet and we get for free. We're kind of stuck in that reaching mode. Yeah. Which, I mean, we could use that to describe most of Western society these days. So as you know, Patrick, you're in good company with that.
Yeah. It's just very interesting because I see myself as a very active person, just being out there, walk every day and, going out. And so just kind of doing this, and I catch myself in the first run through of that cycle as you're going through it. I was like, oh, I'm not, I'm exhaling and I'm done already, and it's still going down.
Yeah.
So I realized I had to slow it down a little bit.
Yeah, my guess is there's at least a couple of the people on the call who have that same struggle. But that is a great litmus test. If you had a hard time with that thing that should have been pretty easy, be excited about this. In other words, if you actually improve just that thing, you're going to notice differences.
Yeah.
So I get very excited when people come in with low scores.
Nice.
Because I know that
I got some more question here.
good.
Carney asked, she's not sure. Sorry, Carney mentioned not sure what you mean by baseline. I believe
baseline CO2. Great. I'm assuming that's what you mean when you say baseline.
I was just going to say the same thing. I believe that's when you were talking about the CO2. Yeah.
Yeah. So just sitting along humming, all of us maintain a certain level of carbon dioxide in the blood. So let's back it up a little bit. The big goal of breathing is to bring oxygen into the body and to expel carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is sort of our waste product, one of the waste products of metabolism. It's how we get rid of that stuff by breathing it out. Now, the cool thing is plants actually take that carbon dioxide. That's their money, and they give off oxygen, which we use. Super cool relationship we have with plants. But we don't blow off all of our carbon dioxide. We really need to hum along with a baseline of carbon dioxide. If we breathe too much, we take that baseline and we drop it down. we move more air. We don't really bump up our oxygen because oxygen for most of us sits at almost full saturation all the time. So by breathing more, we don't get more oxygen because our body can't really take any more. But our carbon dioxide can move really quickly. And so when we breathe too much, we take what should be our baseline at 35 millimeters mercury of pressure. You don't have to remember that. And we start to drop it down, let's say, into the 28, 27 range. Anything less than 32. And I bring up 28 and 27 because there are many people that we start working with that are humming right along at that level. Anything 32 and below actually creates a 25% deoxygenation of the brain. Now, your body figures out how to get that oxygen, but it does it at the expense of other systems. Right. So when I say baseline, we're talking about just what's your normal CO2 level that your body has become acclimated to maintaining. You can change that. It's very trainable. Our factory reset is really at about 35. We can do things with our breathing hygiene that start to bump up that baseline. And as we bump up that baseline CO2, we start to make it easier for hemoglobin to offload oxygen and life gets easier.
I'm assuming with a program, or actually just, is there a way to track that or study, that baseline and sort of assess ourselves, as we're going
Yeah.
through the process?
Yeah, there is technology, and that's the capnography that I talked about. It's relatively expensive technology, not crazy expensive, but most capnographs that you can use in real time, come in at about $4,000. It's what we're using with people, and we've got a love-hate relationship with this technology. Number one, I'd love to do the work without technology. It's the one piece that we hold on to, though, because we know most people are failing in the mixed part of the triangle, and now we've got a piece of technology that lets us see for real, in real time, what's actually happening. And while there are trends where we'll see this activity generally work for this person at this breath fitness score, we frequently get fooled. And so to have something that definitively lets us say, yeah, that is actually moving things forward, or no, that moved it backwards, or to look at that person, let's say that's at a 2.2, and in theory, they should be able to do hyperventilation, big breathing practices, and then actually be able to check them afterwards and say, okay, let's see how you recovered. Right. And if they recovered beautifully, many times they recover better than where they were before. Then we're like, yeah, thumbs up, go after that. But if they come out of that and CO2 is not good, then we may say, let's make sure that we build in a hypoxic training regime with you as well, because we're going to have to do something to kind of make up for what you're losing with the hyperventilation practice. So yes, there's technology out there that lets us take the guesswork out of this.
We got more questions here. So one from S mentioned, have you been able to help people get off the CPAP? And it seems to cause overbreathing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And there are different types of sleep apnea, which is why you would use a CPAP. There are neurogenic driven reasons, and for those people really should stay on a CPAP. And now next, I'm going to say something really radical, and that's most people on a CPAP should not be on a CPAP. They just need to fix their breathing hygiene. So absolutely, yes. We've had many people come off of CPAPs by just cleaning up their hygiene. Even if you just did these two things, which is train your body to sleep on your side and tape your mouth shut at night, that alone gets a bunch of people off. Now, most people need to do a little bit of work to bump up their baseline, do some other things to get breathing going on their side. That all translates to what you do at night. What you do at night is what you've done during the day. It's just that at night, you don't get away with it as well, especially if you're laying on your back where our airway tends to close. So it's, rarely the goal. If I know someone's using a CPAP, it's more like, I let them experiment with coming off it or not. But we do that is a sign to me that we want to move into some of those good hygiene things of getting good at sleeping on our side, at least some of the night, and taping our mouths shut.
And Susie, I could totally relate to you on this one. I find myself feeling that I need a deep breath when I'm sitting doing nothing.
Yeah.
I can relate to that one.
Yeah. And there's a medical term for that. It's called a physiological sigh. And it's a cool thing. And it's a good thing. So we're not going to say don't do it, but let's talk a little bit about why it might be popping up. Number one, just to like hit the history of it, we kind of started to learn the physiological sigh by kind of a horrific way, and that's that when ventilators came out, we knew the science behind how much air people move, per minute, how much they should, and what the breath rate should be. So ventilators came out and they moved that volume of air for people and at that rate, and yet the mortality rate was really high. Once they discovered that this physiological sigh wasn't being accommodated for, in other words, people didn't get that chance to do that big two-phase breath in and then a nice long breath out that pops open the alveoli that otherwise go quiet when we sit at rest, the mortality rate was very high. As soon as they built that physiological sigh in every 5 minutes, which is about what we should be doing, and most of us do it without even realizing we've done it, the mortality rate dropped dramatically. So that physiological sigh, turns out, is actually really important for not our chemistry, not our mechanics, but our psychophysiology, the mind part. Something happens when we pop those alveoli that have closed just because we haven't been needing them, and now we expand all the way. But something happens with the nervous system that's really beneficial. Not completely identified yet, but we realize there's a big neurological gain for that sigh. Now, if that sigh feels like it's happening more frequently, it probably is, because again, most of the time we don't even realize we've done it. Neurological discord or cognitive dissonance or feeling stressed out, those are all reasons why we will sigh more. It's our body trying to self-soothe. Makes sense.
Okay. Got one here from Jane. Jane mentioned, can people with bronchitis benefit as well? And do they breathe differently? And if so, can this difficulty be overcome with skill building?
Yeah. So let's put bronchitis in the same category, and I know it's kind of unfair to do this, with asthma and COPD. The reason I say same category is those are physiological processes that are going on that actually make it hard to get air in. And so while we recognize most people's breathing dysfunction is overbreathing, being kind of stuck in this chronic low-grade hyperventilation, we do have conditions like bronchitis, COPD, asthma that are actually under-breathing problems. So there's actually something in the way of ventilating well. Now, when our body struggles to ventilate, like those three categories, what we tend to do is breathe faster and breathe more shallow. Each breath we take has got a constant amount of dead space. It's about 150 milliliters. In other words, every time we take a breath in, take a breath out, there's a certain amount of volume of air that's sort of useless. We don't get to actually get access to just because it fills the airway from our nose into our lungs. If we're breathing fast, we're now moving more dead space per minute than if we were breathing slower with a little bit bigger volume. So our breathing is incredibly inefficient, makes us feel anxious, makes us feel very unwell. So these conditions like asthma, bronchitis, COPD are frequently made much better by doing something that's counterintuitive, which is slowing the breath down, letting CO2 bump up a bit, just as we did during that activity, so that the body is much more efficient at getting access to oxygen. If, out of feeling uncomfortable from the bronchitis, we start breathing faster and more shallow, we actually drop carbon dioxide, which now does just what we don't want, and that's it traps oxygen in the system. So guess what our body does? It breathes faster, even more, trying to get more air. It's a wild thing. So yeah, even though the mechanism is different behind what's leading people into dysfunction, the remedy is actually very similar. This is what the work of Buteyko had discovered in the 1950s. And he was working primarily with people with asthma and COPD, and then at some point realized, oh my gosh, it's actually the general population benefits from it as well. But these practices really were used to treat it, doing something completely unintuitive, which was training people to actually breathe less per minute, but get more out of it.
Now, speaking about anxiety, Katrina mentioned the curiosity about Anxiety Protection Week that you have on week 7 of your program. Can you share more about that? And can it help protect against panic attacks or involuntary hyperventilation?
Yeah, boy, that sure is the hope. And you're not alone in wanting that, whether it's for yourself or someone you know. It's such a prevalent state. I and I don't think anxiety is unique in its own right. It just ends up being how dysfunction shows up for people, which can show up as depression. It could be anxiety, it could be high blood pressure. Kind of all is kind of a similar root thing. And so, as I wrote out that section, I thought, okay, why is it, we're talking about anxiety and not depression. And, I really just decided I'm going to take that as a general manifestation of things that aren't working real well. And what we do with that practice, or what I've got planned for that time, is to lean into the world of Qigong a bit. And so we're going to take some body movements coordinated with what we're doing with our breath to really hit the mechanical part of it, the chemical part, and the mind part. What I like about Qigong practice is the movements tend to be relatively simple, though they're enough that we have to concentrate so we get the mind to actually focus differently. And then we layer that on top of things that bump the chemistry up and things that are actually just good for our posture and our alignment. Now, in the Qigong world, they also talk about the heart being a center of when we've got excessive energy there, which translates as excessive anxiety. I don't know how much I believe that, and yet I do continue to see it show up really well on the Kaplan trainer. So I have more of a lean to believe it. And there's also something interesting about the Qigong world, talking about the heart being our place of anxiety, is we know that as people improve heart rate variability, resilience to anxiety decreases. So we're going to kind of put our foot into both worlds, kind of the ancient world, this ancient practice that hasn't got science to support it literally, but we've got science emerging around the edge that is starting to say, these people may have been onto something. So I hope that helps.
Let's see here. So a little while ago, you were talking about CO2 baseline, and so Daniel popped in a question. If our body is acidic from years of bad diets, modern stress, etc., don't breath holding exercises like the CO2 increase make our body a little bit more acidic? And could that be harmful for certain people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And here's how I understand it is when you talk about the body being more acidic, you're talking about it at a cellular level. And what we're talking about is what's happening in the blood. And so there's a difference between the two. Hemoglobin lives in the blood. It picks up oxygen from the lungs, carries it around, and then the cells that need it ask for it, and hemoglobin's like, okay, great, here you go. We're talking about the pH of the blood, and we know that actually the most prevalent dysfunction is alkalinity. So our blood is not acidic. Now it gets a little bit dicey to say that our cells are acidic because it varies a ton throughout our body, and unless you're sticking in needles and checking every area of your body, doesn't have to be every cell, but every area, it's hard to really know what that is. But there is some science to say, yeah, there is something about the toxicity of whether it's food, environment, or mental processes that we go through that is elevating cellular acidity. But that's different than what we're talking about with blood pH. So hopefully that helps.
Let's see if Daniel has a follow-up on that. So Carney asked, when you refer to the score 32, I believe that may have been 22, but when you refer to the score of 32, was that a bolt score or using the device you were referring to?
Yeah, that was talking about Capno trainer. So that was CO2 level. Yeah. So I said 35 millimeters mercury of pressure is what's considered normal CO2. You can only see that with a capnograph or by doing an arterial puncture where you're measuring CO2 level. Or you can have somebody wear a cannula. It collects that air and looks at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Yeah. So the BOLT score, which is one of the 7 tests that comprise the breath fitness score, yeah, for that, we're loving it if people are in the 30s for a BOLT score. But again, the BOLT score is just one of 7 tests that gives the breath fitness score.
And a follow-up from Carney, how long will the sessions in the course last, and will there be opportunities for questions?
Yeah, a great question. So we're looking at that being an hour a week that we spend. So we get an hour for 8 weeks. And I think, your gut is exactly right. I think we're going to need additional Q&A time. So right now, my feeling is we'll kind of we'll get the first one going. It's probably going to be best that we keep our hour. It's going to be a mix of lecture and then a mix of doing stuff and then a mix of talking about, what it is you're going to do as your assignment between now and the next week. And my gut is that we may answer a couple of questions there, but I think it's going to be helpful to have a bigger Q&A time that happens in addition. And that can all be recorded and posted in the class as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. And then going back to S, there's a question. Actually, maybe, I guess it is a question. Central is about, this is when you were talking about CPAP. Central is about 0.6 on the CPAP. So doesn't it sound like I would be able to work myself off of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the 0.6 is. You feel free to unmute yourself and tell me a little bit more about that.
S, the floor is yours. Let's see. No mic. Okay.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Well, let me just talk and see if I can accidentally answer it. I don't know, S, if this is where you were going with it. But if you're talking about an AHI index or any of the other index that indicate you need a CPAP, and there's two major ones that they use. If you're on the kind of gray zone, I think there's a really good chance you can come off. In other words, if you weren't at, let's say, 50 apneic events per minute or per hour, then if you're on the lower end of that, the cutoff is usually around 7. If you're somewhere hovering around that, then there's a really good chance that by changing breathing hygiene, you can get yourself to a place where your apneic index drops significantly and you don't need the CPAP.
Thank you. I guess you might have answered the question there.
Okay, great. If I talk long enough, something will happen.
Now, let's see here. From Carney, follow up here. Since most of us would be using the boats, what boat score might loosely correlate with 32 or so with the device?
I'm going to answer this out of both sides of my mouth. So let's go back again to the runners. I want to give this disclaimer first. Runners are this great example of folks who have trained themselves to have really good bolt scores. So they might come in with a bolt score of 35 or 40, which is a good bolt score. And yet their baseline CO2 is humming along at about a 31 or a 30. All right, a couple Olympic runners that I've worked with that just ran in Paris, and that was their story. Now, for most people, there is a correlation. In other words, those two didn't correlate. So even though the numbers sound the same, 31 is very dysfunctional, all right, because you should be at 35 millimeters of mercury of pressure, different units, different measure, whereas a bolt score of 31 is actually good, but they're apples and oranges. Most people, though, their bolt score and their CO2 tolerance test, both tests that measure tolerance to carbon dioxide building, will mirror what their baseline is. So for most people that aren't running around doing amazing feats, really pushing their bodies, if you know CO2 tolerance test and bolt score, you're probably getting a decent indicator of what baseline CO2 is. Again, just doesn't work for everybody. And so to answer your question, if you've got a bolt score that falls in the good range, like 30 seconds or higher, and you're not a runner or an extreme athlete, there is a decent chance that your CO2 may be good as well. Okay, in other words, 35 millimeters of mercury of pressure or better. Does that help?
I wanted to see if Carney wanted to if unmute and come on.
Yeah. Yes, but is there a bolt score that would in a normal person, not a high performing athlete, is there a bolt score that would seem to suggest that you could do the hyperventilation and benefit from it? In other words, that's what you referred to the 32 thing as a criteria for whether you could do that.
Yeah. So the higher the bolt score, the better chance you have that you'd be able to get away with the hyperventilation practices. And I would love to see that bolt score at 35 or higher.
Okay.
What I'd encourage you to do, actually, though, is do the whole breath fitness, do You can do 5 of the 7 tests without the Capno trainer.
Yeah.
In other words, all of you on the call can do 5. I would not look at the Bolt alone. I'd say, what is your breath fitness score? And then take that, to say, how close to you,
Yeah.
the 2.2 are you?
Okay. And then how well does the Bolt score correlate with the CO2 tolerance test? Isn't that the one where you breathe in all the way and then breathe out all the way?
You got it. Yeah. So the CO2 tolerance test is that heroic breath in, and then you're trying to set a new indoor world record for the longest exhale ever, and you're timing that exhale. Those should correlate really closely. Now, they are slightly different because the CO2 tolerance test, like for Patrick, who identified that the exhale was hard, the thing that the CO2 tolerance test also has in it is you've got to have good diaphragm control. So you might have somebody who actually has good tolerance to carbon dioxide building up, but they have terrible diaphragm control. So they're not going to look good on the CO2 tolerance test. And this is why we don't do just one test. None of those tests by themselves are that great. But by the time we triangulate them, now we're getting some confidence that we're getting a snapshot of where somebody really is. But to answer your question, yeah, CO2 tolerance test and Bolt score, if the mechanics are strong, if the diaphragm works well, they should run right together with each other.
I mean, by the same token, I would think you could train yourself with the CO2 tolerance test.
With both of them.
Yeah, I mean, you could train with both of them, but it's also conceivable that you could train with a CO2 tolerance and not do much if you're not doing the specific kinds of Buteyko breathing exercises. Your Bolt score might not come up.
I think if you're improving your CO2 tolerance test, your Bolt score should pull along with it, unless your biggest deficit that was holding you back with the CO2 tolerance test was diaphragm control. Because you will make improvements in diaphragm control by practicing CO2 tolerance test. And that may give you an artificial bump above a Bolt. But if diaphragm was actually playing well, then if you pull CO2 up with a CO2 tolerance test practice, you're going to pull Bolt up with it as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, the Bolt score you take frequently in Oxygen Advantage. Do you ever, and again, yes, I understand what you're saying about the composite breath fitness, but is there any value in fairly frequently taking the CO2 tolerance test?
I put them all in the same category. We check in on them about every 3 weeks. So I think that's about how long it takes for a change to happen. And so, yeah, get your whole breath fitness score every 3 weeks and just see if the stuff that you're doing is actually moving you forward or backwards, or if you're stuck. Yeah, you can use them as practice. So Bolt score and CO2 tolerance tests both can be used as a practice, as long as they're bumping up your CO2 and not driving you backwards.
Hey, David.
Yeah, Jill, hey.
Hi. I just wanted to add here because I've taken David's, training and worked with a Capno trainer, and it really does make a difference when you can actually see what your breathing's doing. And when I first started, I did 4 sessions with the Capno trainer, and I had it at home and I could see on my computer screen. And in a month, I had really increased my CO2 quite a bit. So, and then after that, I knew what my different breathing, the things I was doing that weren't quite right. So I was able to make a big difference for me. So I just wanted to say that because, Dave is absolutely right. It really does make a difference. And yeah, it's a little on the pricey side, but so worth it because you're not going to get that anywhere else, frankly, from what I've seen.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. Jill's doing really great work with people in this world in Seattle.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the CPAP question, and the S who asked the question said it's central apnea. Is that the neuro apnea that you were referring to that needs a CPAP?
Yeah.
Or is that different? Okay, the central apnea is the neuro apnea that needs CPAP. Okay.
You got it. Centrally driven. And yeah, I still think it's good to work on breathing practices, but those people's lives really are being saved by CPAPs. Yeah. So I don't want to undercut the validity of CPAP for folks who are struggling with that. All right. Well, we are 6 minutes over. I apologize for that. Let's let everybody go. I will stay on the call if people have still got questions. I'll stay on a little bit longer. So if you've got a question and you want to hang out, do it. Otherwise, thank you so much for jumping onto this call. Completely fun for me to do, and excited to see people get excited about this stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.